What does joy sound like after 25 years of waiting? For Abraham and Sarah, it sounded like the cry of a newborn child in a quiet desert camp. Years earlier, God had called Abraham away from everything familiar. He promised to make him into a great nation, to bless the families of the earth through him, and to give him a son through Sarah. Abraham believed, but the seasons kept passing. Tents were moved, altars were built, hair turned gray. Still, there was no child. The promise began to feel impossible. Abraham was nearly 100 years old. Sarah was 90, long past the age when anyone expected her to give birth. When she first heard that she would have a son, she laughed quietly. It was not the laughter of celebration. It was the guarded laughter of someone who had hoped for so long that hope itself had begun to hurt. But Genesis chapter 21 opens with simple, powerful words. The Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. At the exact time God had spoken about, Sarah gave birth to a son. The child was not an accident, and he was not a late change in the plan. His arrival showed that the long silence had never meant God had forgotten. Even before anyone in the camp understood what God was doing, the promise had been moving toward this moment. Waiting changed their calendars, but it did not change God's commitment. Imagine that morning, the desert sky brightening over the tents, neighbors hearing the news. Abraham, whose hands had built altars and held the weight of years, now holding a tiny child. Sarah looking down at the face she once thought she would never see. Abraham named the boy Isaac, exactly as God had instructed. The name means, "He laughs." What had once expressed disbelief was transformed into joy. Sarah said that God had brought her laughter, and everyone who heard what had happened would laugh with her. The camp had known Abraham and Sarah as the elderly couple who kept speaking about a promise. Now the promise could be held, wrapped, fed, and carried. Each ordinary sound of the baby was evidence that the story was moving forward. When Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham marked him as part of God's covenant, just as he had been commanded. Nothing graphic needs to be shown for us to understand the meaning. Abraham was responding in obedience. This child belonged within the promise God had been unfolding across the years. Sarah could hardly believe the change. Who would have told Abraham that she would nurse a child? Who would have imagined laughter filling their home at such an age? Yet there she was, holding Isaac while family and servants celebrated around her. This does not mean that every wish will arrive in the way or at the time we choose. Isaac was a specific covenant promise within God's rescue story. The passage does not ask us to turn every desire into a guarantee. It teaches something deeper. Delay is not proof that God is absent. Human limitation does not limit him. And when God makes a promise, time cannot make him forget it. Abraham and Sarah did not wait perfectly. They became afraid, made mistakes, and sometimes tried to solve the future themselves. Yet God remained faithful to his word. Isaac's birth did not celebrate their perfect patience. It celebrated God's perfect faithfulness. Perhaps that is why this story still reaches people who have waited through disappointment. The answer is not to pretend that waiting is easy. Sarah's earlier laughter reminds us that long hope can become painful. But her later laughter shows that sorrow does not always receive the final word. In one small tent beneath a wide desert sky, a baby breathed, an old couple smiled, and an ancient promise took another step toward fulfillment. Through Isaac would come Jacob, then Israel, and generations later, the blessing promised for all nations would point toward Jesus. The impossible child had arrived. The silence was broken, and Sarah laughed again, this time with joy. But the story of Abraham and Isaac was not finished. Years later, father and son would climb a mountain together, and Abraham would face the hardest test of his faith. That is where our next story begins.